Hello and welcome to a stats video based on my Formula 1.5 season for 2014. My name is Alex does F1 stuff, and today we will be going over any and pretty much every random weird stat that popped up throughout my series that I have run. So if you're new and haven't seen that series, I'll pop a link to it in the description to the playlist that I created, and also in a card in the corner too. And now that university is all finished, I have begun working on Formula 1.5 season for 2015, so that is currently going on. It might be out in the next 3-4 weeks, depending on how quickly I get all the animations and tables and things created. But without further ado, we will jump straight in and have a look at the qualifying statistics for 2014. So right here is the table of each of their qualifying positions. In hindsight, what I should have done is, instead of highlighting like I have done first, second and third, I should have also highlighted Q1s and Q2s, just to make it a little bit more colourful and not as number heavy. But anyway, this is a table that we will be coming back to a lot, and the way I've ordered it is by teammates, no particular order, as McLaren should really be in front of Force India, but that's not too big of an issue. So the first thing to look at is quite clearly the dominance of Williams in qualifying. So they took 15 out of the 19 available pole positions, with 10 in a row from Germany all the way through to Abu Dhabi in round 19. So it was a fairly dominant display, and honestly equally dominant from Bottas taking 11 pole positions, with Massa taking 4, and then Hülkenberg, Button, Magnussen and Vergne, getting confused because I've started 2015, Vergne taking 1 pole position each. So the next thing I kind of wanted to do was work out an average, what was their average qualifying position out of the whole list. So I've come up with, again, a graph that looks a bit like this. At the bottom it's not ordered, clearly it's not ordered in position, which may have looked a bit neater. It's again ordered in exactly the same way that the table was. So you've got Bottas just above 2, Massa around 4, Hülkenberg just below 6, with Perez between 8 and 6 as well, all the way up until the latter end of the field, with Ericsson around 15, same with Lotterer and Stevens on 14. But again, coming back to this little table here, I then went about trying to work out consistency throughout qualifying, and who was the most consistent, because you can see that although Bottas has had a lot of firsts and seconds, there are some 13th, 7th, 9th and 6th on there. So yes, he's had, what would that be, 15 front row positions, but 4 are not even on the second row, they're on the third and below. So would you class that as consistent? Would you class someone, say for example Magnussen, who's had a couple pole positions, a lot of thirds, fourths, with a lower position of 9th? So there are a few ways I could have worked this out. I could have worked out the range between the highest and their lowest position, but when I did that, there was a lot of, everyone sort of had the same. There was all lots of 5s, 6s, up until Bottas and Massa as well, because Massa's had a 14th and a 1st, who had a big disparity in their range. So instead I kind of settled for their standard deviation, which is a bit difficult to explain because I can't remember exactly. So it is literally just a way of expressing how much the values differ from the mean. So you calculate the mean value of all of them, and then how much those particular values differ. So if you have a lower standard deviation, you're more consistent, and a higher standard deviation, you're less consistent. There are numerous other ways that I could have gone about working out consistency, but I thought this was the better way. So as you can clearly see from this graph, you've got Ericsson, Kobayashi, Bianchi all at the front, being the most consistent, with Bottas and Massa being, by quite far and away, by quite a big leap, the least consistent. However, they were the best qualifiers because they had the most front row starts, and so they were the best qualifiers, but they were equally the least consistent. But you can see that Button is also up there, in front of Chilton, Kvyat, Sutil and Magnussen as well. where you get to the other front row championship contenders such as Hulkenberg and Perez. They're also in the latter half. So Button, showing his maturity, being one of the older drivers on this grid, that he is actually fairly consistent. But if we take a look at how this works with the individual driver's perspective, so taking the least consistent and the most consistent, and what does that actually look like visually. So Massa here is the least consistent, and you can clearly see it's all uppy downy, with his highest position being a 14th and his lowest position being a 1st a couple times on pole. But you can clearly see it is very uppy downy everywhere all across the board, compared to Ericsson, who is the most consistent. Yes, he was consistently last, but he was still like always last until the last couple rounds where he hit an 11th place. If you think about it, it's kind of like 2019 when Mercedes went through that 5-1-2 finishes in a row. Everyone was saying, they're the most consistent team on the world, that no one's ever going to beat them. But if you think about it consistently, Williams went last and second last for those 5 races as well, so they were equally as consistent. They were just at the opposite ends of the grid, but no one ever really talked about that. But the next thing I worked out for, again, consistency was their consecutive positions. So how many times someone had, in Bianchi's case, how many times they scored 13th in a row. For example, that was 5 times that he scored that. Bottas had 1st 4 times, with Hulkenberg 5th 4 times as well. All the way down to people like Maldonado, who only had 2 consecutive races, 2 back-to-back races, but he had that for 11th, 12th and 16th places. Now this was the most interesting thing that I actually did, the driver's modal position. So with the mode, it is simply their most common position that they have achieved. So you can quite clearly see that I've ordered it in position at the bottom, and I've just realised Chilton doesn't have a TH after 15, that looks stupid. Anyway, so they're all ordered in that position, so it goes from 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, all the way up to 16th. And you can see Bottas has 11 firsts, Massa has 7 seconds, then Magnussen, Button, Hulkenberg all have 6 as their modal position being 3rd, 4th and 5th. So I thought that doesn't really look too appealing. It doesn't really show what I want it to. So I thought I could do like a heat map kind of thing, and I actually am really happy with this graph because it shows, or table I suppose. So what this shows is how many times the first place was achieved, and again it's ordered in the same. Bottas had 11 firsts, then Massa had 7 seconds, etc. It all goes parallel down that line, ordered as 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th for Bottas, Massa, Magnussen, Button, etc. So that when we do put a heat map across it, we do get this nice correlation between position and driver. But you can quite clearly see that there are a few outliers, with Grosjean with his 2nd place in the bottom left hand side, and then the Williams pair completely dominate the top right hand side with their high placed finishes at 12th, 13th, 14th, maybe 9th and 10th as well. But then I suppose if you include their 9th and 10th, you would also include Hulkenberg's 12th place finish as well as a bit of an outlier. There were obviously a ton more statistics that I can randomly pull from this, but I just felt that they were the main like body of them. That sort of showed sort of everything, I feel. But obviously something that I didn't actually cover in the 1.5 series as I was going through it was the teammate battles. So we start off with Williams, of course. That was 13-6 to Bottas. Then you go to McLaren, which was fairly even actually, 10-9 to Button. Force India, 12-7 to Perez. Then you have Toro Rosso, 12-7 to Kvyat. Lotus was a bit more dominant there, 15-4 to Grosjean. Then Sauber was like McLaren, or almost equal at 10-9 to Sutil. Then Marussia, 12-3 to Bianchi. They didn't finish the last, 4 races? So that's why it only adds up to 15. And then there is always a weird one. You've got Caterham, which had 3 sets of teammates for a race weekend. So you had Kobayashi, outqualifying Ericsson 12-3, then Lotterer outqualified Ericsson 1-0, and then Kobayashi outqualified Stevens 1-0. So moving on to the races now, it is again a very similar story. We get to a graph that looks, or a table that looks a bit like this. Now the first thing to notice is honestly the amount of DNFs that there were. That there were a considerable amount, especially Canada. I think there were, what's that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 DNFs in Canada out of a 14 or 16 driver field. That's actually a lot. But you can really see the sort of turning point in the championship was Austria, which was where Williams just took it. Just completely every single victory from Austria, apart from Japan, they won. They were always on the podium from... Well, they were always on the podium, just full stop. They were always there throughout the whole season, but they were always first and second from Austria onwards. They also had the most 1-2 finishes as well of anybody. Why didn't I total that up? So Williams scored 4 1-2 finishes to Force India's 1 and also McLaren's 1. So if I just pull up a graph now for the race wins, this was a bit more even than the qualifying, with both Bottas and Massa securing 6 wins, with Hülkenberg 3, Button 2, Perez and Magnussen 1 apiece. But the next thing I did was work out the DNFs, as there were a considerable number. Every single driver had at least one DNF this whole season, with Sutil having an astonishing 8 out of 19 races. That's just under 50% retirement rates. That's not great at all. And you have a couple drivers on 7, a lot of drivers on 5, and then it nicely droops off all the way to Bottas and Magnussen, who both had 1. But as always, we come back to this graph here, and similarly to qualifying, I've done the modal positions and ordered them accordingly, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, according to their modal position, and we've come up with this heat map again, which shows a beautiful correlation. Importantly to note here though, no one scored 16th place, as each race there was a DNF, so 16th place wasn't available to finish, as you weren't classified if you finished 16th. I hope that sort of makes sense as to why 16th is left blank when it was a 16 grid or 16 driver grid. But again, consistency comes into this as well. I wanted to work out the most consistent driver, but you can quite clearly see that it is probably going to be Bottas, as he had what was that, a 6th, 5th, 4th, 4th, and also a DNF. The DNF will definitely bring him down. So there is the consistency graph, and you can quite clearly see that Bottas is the most consistent driver, all the way up to Massa, who was the least consistent. So as you can see by this consistency graph, Bottas was the most consistent race runner compared to his least consistent qualifying running, with Massa all the way at the end being the least consistent racer and also the least consistent qualifier. However, he did end up finishing 2nd in the Drivers' Championship. So if you have a look at the personal graphs as well of the race finishes, you can see Bottas, apart from his DNF, which I've rated as position 20 on here, it is just a nice flat with a 6th just above that 5th line, but it is that 20 that pulls him up. But if you compare this to Grosjean, I should have put this as Massa. I thought Grosjean was the least consistent, but quite clearly my other graph said it was Massa. But you can again see the ups and downs, the peaks and the troughs of this graph. It's not straight at all, so it's very, very inconsistent, with 1 second place, a couple thirds, and then a lot of retirements and some midfield position finishes. So it got me wondering who would be the most consistent over the whole weekend. Rather than thinking it as qualifying and the race, who's the most consistent over the whole qualifying or whole race weekend? And as you can see there, it is actually Jenson Button. The man who finished 3rd in the championship was the most consistent qualifier and the most consistent racer combined, which I suppose would be a testament to his age and maturity, being able to know the limits of the car and to put it exactly where he wants it. even if it's not first, he's still getting podiums, second places, a couple fourths and fifths with the odd victory here or there, which is exactly what a champion needs. They need that consistency, and then quite quickly it steeps up towards Massa at the end, who was the least consistent over the whole weekend as a whole, which is quite surprising considering he still managed to finish second in the championship when he was just the least consistent at everything. I also quite liked this one as well, which was a side-by-side comparison of their consistency between the race and the qualifying. So the race is in the blue with the qualifying in the orange, and you can see the button was fairly equal on both. Kobayashi had a little bit of disparity, with the most coming from Bottas, with being the most consistent racer, but the second least consistent qualifier. But just looking briefly at the actual Drivers' Championship now, this is how it sort of went as time progressed, looking at the graphs, and you can see it sort of just split. Everyone just fanned out. There was no real battles. You can see the crossover at Germany for the championship lead between Bottas and Hülkenberg, and that was really it. Nothing else really happened. There was a bit of crossover with Perez, Magnussen and Massa in the middle of the season, and then Massa just disappeared off away from them to end up finishing second. Unfortunately, I can't quite zoom in enough on the lower half of the grid, but again, it is all just layers. So the Constructors' Championship was slightly different. You can see that McLaren started leading for the first two races and were overtaken by Force India as they had a good first half, but you can see that after they had their double DNF and that nice horizontal with the crossover point with Williams, that they just didn't have enough to come back at Williams for that title, and ended up actually losing out to McLaren as well. But what I like about this one is you can clearly see the midfield that Toro Rosso found themselves in, and also partly Lotus. They were just in their own battle. They weren't next to each other for any real length of time apart from Monaco and I suppose Austria, but equally Lotus just wasn't close enough to the Saubers, the Mauritius and the Caterhams to really battle them either, or to be close to them. And lastly, we will go over the racing teammate battles. So Williams, it was actually fairly equal, 10-9 to Bottas. Force India was again fairly even, 11-8 to Hülkenberg. McLaren was a lot more dominant though, 15-4 to Magnussen. Toro Rosso again 11-8 to Kvyat. Lotus also 11-8, with Sauber also 11-8 as well. Marussia 9-6 to Bianchi, outracing Chilton, and again Caterham being the weird team of the season, 9-6 to Kobayashi against Ericsson, 1-0 to Kobayashi against Lotterer, and 1-0 to Stevens against Kobayashi. And that is the end of my little stats video for my Formula 1.5 season for 2014. I know I haven't covered literally every single corner, nook and cranny of all the random stats, but I've just sort of tried to tabulate and illustrate random things that have occurred. I think for the next one for 2015 I'll do similar sorts of things like this, but I might include extra bits like the closest qualifying, or did anyone set the same time as each other, or random flukes, things like any driver that scores 1 minute 17.777 because 777 or 666 and the devil and whatever. Just other random bits of stats like that you occasionally see on like the Formula 1 Instagram page or something like that. But I think what I've just done here is a fairly good overall picture of my Formula 1.5 season for 2014. Obviously it is entirely fictional, so there's not really much to read into this at all. But anyway, be on the lookout for the future Formula 1.5 season for 2015, as that should be out in the next month or so. But yeah, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will catch you in the next one with whatever I decide to make. I'll see you then.